Welcome back to another Extreme Book Club video. Today we have a cult classic of a disturbing book called Wasp Factory by Iain Banks, a novel that could be called a progenitor of the splatterpunk genre, although it isn't as horrible as some of the others we've covered like The Slob or even Gone to See the Riverman. Something different about this book, however, compared to some of the other ones we've covered, is it seems to want to tell the story for the story's sake. I feel that all the horribleness isn't in the book for shock value like some of the others, even if it might seem that way sometimes. The violence and horribleness of this book isn't the main point of it. There's a reason it's in there, and there's a reason the story is being told. Also, unlike a lot of the other books we've covered, this one actually can be quite funny at times. I'm not sure I have laughed at any of the other books we've covered almost at all on this channel. Maybe once or twice in some weird situation, but there are quite a few moments in this book that got me to giggle or at least blow air out of my nose. A disclaimer though, that this book is one of, if not the oldest book we've covered, coming out in 1984. There are a few things in this book that aren't really normal today as it was then. Of course, that's not to say it's okay, but be warned for that. In fact, some of the parts of the crudeness and non-political correctness is there to make a point in the story. So stick with it even if it comes out of nowhere. However, by the end, you'll be surprised how forward-thinking it was for its time, even despite of, or maybe even because of, its contents sometimes. The book is a really good read, and you obviously should read it first before watching this video, as there's quite a few twists and turns that I certainly didn't see coming. But if you don't know how we review stuff on this channel, let me break it down for you. I start out with an intro, which you are listening to now. Then we get into the summary, which takes up most of the video. And finally, we have an analysis at the end to discuss the messages or themes or takeaways of the book. This book has quite a lot in terms of analysis as well, so I'm excited to share it with all you guys. So I hope you enjoy the video as you play games or draw or something as you listen. Background video will be of some gameplay, but I will let you know if there's something particularly interesting pertaining to the book and when it's on screen. So without waffling on any further, let's get into Iain Banks's The Wasp Factory. He was making his rounds around the island. He had to check all of the poles keeping watch over the island. The poles had animal heads sticking out of them, as if literally keeping watch over things. He then climbed up the dune and looked over the bridge from the mainland to the island. He then sees Diggs, the town police officer, pedaling his bike over the bridge. Diggs got to the gate and pressed the intercom button. The policeman said something into the intercom and the gate opens. Our main character, Frank, takes out a slingshot, which he calls a catapult in this book, and takes out a metal ball and shoots a private property sign with it. Frank smiles after hitting his mark, and thought that was a good omen. The factory wasn't really specific about what happens, so this was a good sign. Frank thought to go home, but he figured his father wouldn't want him there right now. His father didn't like for him to be there when Diggs was there, so instead, he decided to go check on the poles again. He walked over to one, animal heads affixed to it with a black ribbon tied around it, swaying in the wind. He left his bags of severed heads in the bunker just as nightfall approached after that. The birds had told him that Diggs had finally left his home, so he headed back. The lights were on as usual. He walked inside and his father was putting out a cigar. Diggs was just here, just so you know. Frank puts his stuff down and gets ready for dinner at the table. "It's Eric," his father said. But he didn't have to say anything else. Frank already knew what his father was going to say. He figures maybe his half-brother Eric could have died or something, but he knew better. "Eric escaped from the hospital. Diggs thinks he'll come here," his father says. Frank knew his brother would get here. No way he wouldn't. He wouldn't even have to ask the factory about that. He figures that the people in town were going to talk about this. The boy who set fire to dogs was loose. Frank's father poured him some soup as he thought about his poles. They were a deterrent, Frank thinks. They were on the dunes so people knew not to come near. Frank's father was tall and slim, his face feminine, but he walked with a limp. He has to walk with a cane, and that cane is a symbol of Frank's privacy. Frank sleeps in the loft, which is also where the Wasp Factory is, but his father cannot climb up there with the limp. "How tall is that table?" Frank's dad asks. 30 inches, Frank says. "Wrong. It's 2'6", Frank's dad says. This was a normal thing for Frank and his dad. It was a weird quirk of his doctor father. He knew the measurements of every single thing in the house. Whether that be a door, a book, a table, he knew the measurements. There are little sticky notes all over everything in the house with the measurements of that item. When Frank was young, he tore them all off once, and his father belted him for it. Frank remembers it because he was having one of his imaginary wars at the time, which, sidebar here, he never says that his wars are imaginary, but just know every time he mentions one, he's talking about like an imaginary play war in his head. His father also made Frank learn all of the measurements too, in addition to his normal homeschool lessons. Frank also hates that all of the measurements are in the imperial system. They lived in Scotland. They should have gone to the metric years ago, he tells his father over soup. That's rubbish. The metric system is based on the measurements of the globe, and I don't have to tell you how dumb that is, his father says. His father used to tell Frank that the planet was actually a Mobius strip instead of a globe, something he maintains to this day. He writes a manuscript about this theory every 3 months and sends it to universities. Frank thinks it's just to mess with the universities. One of his father's little bouts of trolling, pretty much. He thinks his father's life wouldn't be half as fun without doing that every 3 months. His father asks, what was he up to today? And Frank says, just walking around the island. His father says he hopes he wasn't killing any god's creatures or anything. Frank thinks, of course he was. How else was he going to supply the poles with heads for the bunker? He has to kill things. His father says, sometimes I think you should have been the one we sent to the mental hospital instead of Eric. He didn't mean that, Frank thinks, but his father was just trying to hurt his feelings. But normally he wouldn't just say that out of nowhere. He must really be worried about Eric escaping. But Frank thinks that he's worried about himself too. Frank has a disability, but he doesn't say what right here, and besides, Frank represents a crime in his father's head. Frank, legally, was not born. 17 years ago, when Frank's dad was a hippie, he refused to register Frank with the National Insurance Agency, so he doesn't have a birth certificate or anything. Not that Frank minds. He feels he knows more than most people his age, ever since he was old enough to go into Port Nail, the closest town alone. He was able to go to the library and read things when he was old enough. His father homeschooled him, and at first he told him silly little lies just to mess with Frank for fun. Until he was old enough to go to the library, he thought that Pathos was the name of one of the Three Musketeers, he thought Virtuous was the name of a town in China, and Fellatio was a character in Hamlet. Ever since Frank was able to go to the library, though, his father hasn't been able to indulge in his rather immature sense of humor. They live on an island just off the mainland of Scotland. Frank figures that his family used to be landowners, but now they just own this little island off the coast of Scotland. He sometimes goes into Port Nail and sees punk bands at a bar with his only friend, Jamie the Dwarf, who he puts on his shoulder so he can see the bands over the crowds. Well, I'm sure they'll find him and take him back to the hospital, his father says, eating his soup. He gets up, washes his dishes, and says he's going to go to his study. Some place Frank has never been in his entire 17 years on this earth. He knows that there's a secret in his father's study, as his father has hinted as much towards him. One small way that his dad likes to keep the power dynamic of the father-son relationship. Frank thinks that's pathetic, though. Frank finishes his soup and goes to the bathroom for a dump. He didn't have to pee because he peed on all the poles earlier to mark his scent, his power. Besides, he has to sit down to pee anyway due to his disability. Like a bloody woman, Frank says. Sometimes at the bar, he uses a urinal, but most of his pee just kind of trickles down his legs. He felt bad about Eric, though. Poor bugger. He wonders how he would have coped with the trauma if what happened to Eric happened to him, but it didn't. It happened to Eric, and it made him what he was. Which, no, Frank doesn't say what happened to Eric yet, and that comes way later in the book. But something made Eric go crazy, some sort of trauma, it would appear. Just then, Frank hears the phone ringing and gets off the toilet and answers it. Port Nail 531, Frank says coldly. Frank, it's me. Hello. He could recognize it was Eric by his voice. Hi, Eric. Where are you? Well, here, of course. Where is here? It's here. You don't know where here is? Stop being silly, Eric. I can't tell you where I am. If I do, you'll tell Dad and they'll take me back to the fucking hospital. Fine. How are you? Insane, you know. That got Frank to at least smile. Look, I assume you're coming here. Just don't burn any dogs along the way. Burn dogs? I don't burn dogs. Who do you think you are, you little bastard? You little fucking bastard, he said, screaming. Look, Eric, sorry, Frank said quickly. I just want you to be okay. Just don't antagonize people. Frank then says how he misses Eric, and Eric asks why he doesn't visit him at the hospital then. Frank says he doesn't like to leave the island overnight and makes him nervous. Eric says, okay, and they continue. Do you want to talk to Dad? No, I'll talk to him when I get closer so he can't take me back to the hospital. Look, Eric, just be careful. Don't antagonize people. People are awful sensitive nowadays, especially about their pets. What do you mean by that, you little shit? Are you accusing... The phone cut out. His money must have run out. Frank looks towards the study. His dad must have not heard him. Good. Frank goes to bed and watches TV and listens to his radio. He looks at himself in the mirror in his room. He's a little too chubby still, he thinks. He's not that chubby, but he doesn't look like he wants to be. He wants to look dark and menacing, the way he feels on the inside. Looking at him the way he is now, you wouldn't have expected him to have killed 3 people in his past. He goes to bed. He needs to get up early anyway to find a wasp for the factory. The next day, after consulting the Wasp Factory, Frank takes the burned body of the wasp and puts it in a little matchbox. He left the house and walked down to the dunes, making jet noises as he did. Things like fur and bursh and kind of that stuff. He checks on the poles once again and they looked fine. He takes out a knife and nicks his thumb and spreads his own blood on the poles. He grabs the ball bearing he shot at the sign yesterday and picks it up. Frank then explains something about his older brother. This is something he does during this book quite a lot. He will break up the main narrative with just a random story. This happens pretty often. He says that Eric's birth mother died during childbirth, Eric's head being too big for the hole. His mother bled out right then and there. He figures that's why Eric has migraines. His head got stuck. Frank says that he figures that means Eric is a murderer too. Frank's not the only one in the family, but he obviously had not meant to kill his own mother. But Frank says it's not the thought that counts in that kind of situation. He continues with the main story then, saying that the Wasp Factory implied a fire of some sort was going to happen. But the factory obviously doesn't say how a fire was going to happen. Frank concludes that it obviously has something to do with Eric setting fire to dogs. But Frank knows that the factory works in mysterious ways, so he wouldn't say that that was the definitive meaning of the message that the factory gave him. Frank says he's sort of sad that Eric is coming home though now. He was planning on having another war, but he doesn't want to have to stop it halfway through. He then says that he used to have fantasies about saving the island from a fire with a dam. He says when he was younger, and even recently, he used to love to build dams and rivers, just for fun. He figures that no matter what, you can't really win a war against water. He then explains that there's a few things in life as self-fulfilling as dam building. Give him a stream and all day to be alone, and he'll be happy any day. As the sun got a little higher in the sky, Frank was finishing up his dam. He says letting a dam burst or overflow to see the carnage was just as fun as building one. After he did, he returned home for the day. He got home and started eating lunch with his father. Salad and rice. He notices his father is in his town clothes, which is unusual because it's Thursday, and his father usually stays home on Thursday. Maybe he was on his way to Inverness on a business trip or something. He did that sometimes. Maybe he was going into town to help with the search for Eric even. He tells Frank that he won't be home till later, so lock up after he's gone. He has a spare key. Frank just agrees and says he'll be okay. His father cleans up his plate and says, "Oh, by the way, if Diggs comes by, just stay out of his way." Frank agrees and his father leaves. Frank immediately springs up and checks the door to the study, but it holds fast. One day he'll forget to lock it, Frank thinks. Frank goes and grabs his air rifle from his room and goes to the rabbit grounds. He says he doesn't like using an air rifle a lot of the time because it's almost too accurate. When you use a slingshot, you have to be accurate, and you have to be in the right mind and everything else. It comes from within. But with the rifle, it was too easy. Surgical, almost. But when hunting rabbits, Frank has to use it. They're too fast otherwise. He then mentions how none of his family has ever died to a gun, weirdly enough. His family has had a lot of unfortunate deaths, but none of them have died to a gun, weirdly. He mentions how one of them died from shock after a man killed himself right in front of him, and another died to suicide accidentally when he lit a cigarette in a gas-filled room, which was coincidentally the way he was trying to commit suicide with, the gas, not the cigarette. Frank then makes his way silently to the hill overlooking the rabbits. He then waited for nightfall. He watched the bunnies on the hill and saw a bunch of holes and snares set by other boys on the hill. He wondered if any of them had actually ever been caught in their own snares. But that's when he notices it. The buck. A massive rabbit, 4 times the size of any other rabbits. Frank figures that the head of that thing would be great for one of the poles. Frank takes a second to get his gun ready and keeps staring at the buck. He wonders if that thing's even real. It's standing motionless. Frank wondered if some kids from town were pranking him or something. Frank moves his head a little bit too fast though. Too fast to look natural, and he looks back down a sight and notices the buck is gone. He confusedly wonders where'd it go. Couldn't have been down the holes, he's too big. But then he noticed it. The buck was dead sprinting at him, like a bullet. Normally a rabbit wouldn't do that, but this buck was actually charging him. He didn't have time to aim back down the sights and shoot. The rabbit was already almost on him. Frank drops his gun in surprise and hits his knees on the way down. The only thing he could do was put his hands up to cover his throat. He pulls out his slingshot as fast as he can and wraps the rubber of the strings around the rabbit's neck, but it kept going, gnawing and chomping on the air, like a zombie or something. He couldn't let go of the rubber in fear of being bit by this rabbit, so he kept squeezing it, but it would not die. He thought about headbutting the rabbit, but he didn't want to go near its teeth. Its neck twists a bit and finally nips Frank's fingers a bit. This gives Frank a small boost from his anger, and finally he snaps the neck of the rabbit with the slingshot. He gets up and looks on the ground. The rabbit, dead. Its neck broken. But his slingshot also snapped in the struggle. Frank was pissed. He ran away with his gun, angry as hell, all the way back to his house, and he went to his shed. He'd let these rabbits live too long. He grabs his quote-unquote war bag and runs back to the rabbit grounds. He puts a fucking homemade pipe bomb in one of the rabbit holes, and one in the butthole of the buck. He then takes out a flamethrower and lights the fuse on the pipe bomb in the hole. It explodes softly underground and a few rabbits come up, bleeding from their noses and eyes. Frank then takes his flamethrower and lights the remaining ones he finds on fire, the poor things burning in the moonlight. As he does, he lights the fuse of the buck's pipe bomb and it explodes. Viscera lands all over, and a few pieces land near him. Frank sat up triumphantly in the moonlight as one rabbit manages to run away. He then sets fire to his slingshot broken on the ground, which he had named the Black Destroyer. And then he names this place Black Destroyer Hill, in honor of his fallen slingshot. He walks home with his war bag and sees the one bunny that escaped drinking water from a stream. He kicks it in the water. Frank then tells us about another family member who died in a weird way. His uncle on his mom's side. One that took care of Eric for some time, actually. He committed suicide by drill. He had second thoughts after drilling in his skull about halfway through, and he drove himself to the hospital where he died. Frank thinks that he sort of had a hand in that one, though. He killed himself about a year after their daughter, Esmeralda, died. One of Frank's 3 victims. Frank gets home and thinks that the fire today must have been some unconscious response to the Wasp Factory telling him about the fire. Perhaps a self-fulfilling prophecy. He then thought about it and how, in his anger just now, he was just like his first victim, Blythe, his cousin. You see, long ago, when Frank was just 5 years old, he and Eric had a bunch of pretty little rabbits they liked playing with. But one day, Blythe came over and burned them all alive with a flamethrower. They're beautiful, poor little rabbits. Eric was inconsolable. He was always sensitive, like a girl, Frank says. People thought that Eric would go far, at least before it happened to him. Frank wasn't so upset about the rabbits in his young age, but he was more upset about how upset Eric was. He wanted to kill Blythe right there, but he didn't. Next year, Blythe came back and was even more annoying. He had lost his leg playing chicken with a car on his bike. He had an ugly, hollow, pink prosthetic leg after that. He was 10 and very active until that accident. But when he came back, he was still bitter because of his new injury, unable to play football and everything. So, he took it out on Frank, who had his own disability, but Frank was in much better shape than Blythe ever was. At 6 years old, Frank made sure to act like he was roughhousing along with Blythe and was getting along with him, letting him wrestle and punch him in the face. Eric had to restrain him a couple times when he did something particularly nasty though, like trying to throw Frank and Eric's then alive little brother in a river to see if he'd float. But it was normal for the most part, until they all took a nap on a grassland on the south side of the island. Blythe had taken off his prosthetic leg to nap and fell asleep. Frank got up before them and took a walk to the bunker, a place he liked even then. He found a sleeping venomous snake in it. He thought about what happened to his rabbits the previous year and made a plan. He grabbed a piece of driftwood and put the snake in a rusty can, as it was being ornery and fighting back at that time. He brought the can back to the group quietly and was very careful not to wake any of them. He put the snake in the hollowed out prosthetic leg and then threw the can over the dunes. He then pretended to go back to sleep. Eric woke up a bit later, who in turn woke everybody else. Blythe then suggested a game of soccer on his own, and then he strapped on his leg. No one even suspected there was foul play that day. From the moment that Blythe jumped and squirmed around and screamed and cried, until the moment he was in the hospital choking back his last breaths. No one suspected it was anything but an accident. Eric was even horribly sad for Blythe and his parents. Frank tried to tell him that it was retribution from God for killing the rabbits, but Eric said God didn't really work like that. Frank later named that patch of grass Snake Park. Back in the present, Frank lay awake thinking of all of this stuff when his father didn't come home. He was always wondering if his father died, how would he feel? He would get tons of sympathy and get to go crazy for a while, he thinks. Death does that. 3 years after Blythe died all those years ago, Frank killed his own younger brother Paul for an entirely different reason. Then 2 years after that, he killed his cousin Esmeralda on more or less a whim. Frank says he's done with killing people now though. It was just a phase. Yeah, we've all been there, right? Just warning you here, this next chapter starts out like crazy as hell, so be warned. Frank starts this chapter with the sentence that his two greatest enemies in this world are women and the ocean. He says he doesn't like women because they are weak and soft and always will be worse at everything than men. Nice, Frank. And the ocean he hates because it destroys all of his hard work on stuff like his dams. But he sort of respects the ocean for that, but not women. He doesn't even like women being on his island, even Mrs. Clamp, who is so old and ancient she's like sexless to Frank. But she was a woman at some point, he figures. Mrs. Clamp was their maid and grocery store delivery person. Frank doesn't really like her, obviously. Frank then says he woke up that morning like any other. He wondered if his father ever got home last night, but instead of checking, he does his morning routine, where he shaves his very little stubble, poops, showers, and stuff like that. Notably though, he says sometimes he doesn't bathe so he can get toenail cheese or belly button lint. He says he doesn't like to do that because it makes him feel really dirty, but sometimes he needs it to mark his territory with. What? He then gets dressed in the same thing he wears every day. Khakis, boots, and a green army jumper. In the winter months, when it's cold, he wears a vest under the jumper. He grabs his knife, his slingshot, and other stuff and walks outside into the damp morning. It looked like it was gonna rain. He walked up the hill and ate an apple and overlooked a muddy creek. There was a tree, and Frank thinks this is where old Saul's skull was. He then randomly says that he used to have a slingshot called the Killer, which was actually just a stationary catapult made out of the tree he's looking at, which was once a sapling when he was younger. He used to go into town and buy hamsters from pet stores and launch them over a wall with this catapult. But he says it was all in search of old Saul's skull, which if you're wondering how that makes any sense that he was launching hamsters over a wall to look for a skull of some kind, no, it doesn't make sense. I don't think it's supposed to. Frank then throws the apple core into the muddy river and thinks it's time to go to the bunker. He gets there and goes inside, and there it was. Old Saul's skull, with candles coming out of his eyes. If you need a visual, it's on the cover of the book. It's this skull here. It's a dog skull with candles coming out of it. You see, Frank does a lot of weird stuff, to say the least. A lot of which has to do with divination of some kind. His own form of fortune telling. This is one of the ways that he does this in this bunker, with old Saul's skull with the candles. In these candles, there are wasps. Wasps that Frank has covered with candle wax like a prison, so they suffocate. Something he did a while ago. He sits down in the bunker and focuses on the skull as he lights the candles in it. He pictures the rabbit hill from yesterday and tries to picture himself as he thinks he should be. Tall and skinny, dark and brooding. The candles flicker in Saul's eyes, and Frank stops. He looks around the bunkers and sees all the heads of animals looking down on him. Trophies of sorts he's taken from things that he's killed during his life that he has hung in the bunker. He takes the carcass of a wasp out of the matchbox and takes his quote-unquote precious fluids and pours them on the body of the wasp. And actually, when he says precious fluids, he means like gas, believe it or not. He then lights it, and it pops and explodes in a tiny way. Frank then closes his eyes really tight, with the bright light burned into his eyes, making weird images and shapes, like when you stare at the sun too long. He tries to picture Eric's face through this divination, but he gets nothing. He tidies up the bunker and goes back home, where he sees his dad out front, who says that he got home late last night, so he just let Frank sleep in. He asks if Frank wants lunch, to which he says, yeah. But Frank says he wants to make it this time, but his father says no, he'll make it. Frank can chop firewood or something. After lunch, Frank went into town and bought more pellets for his air gun and slingshot, as well as he got a coffee from a cafe and played a game of Space Invaders. Cringe. You want a real retro game? Play Tempest. That's a real game right there. Frank laments on how he didn't grow up with anyone his own age. His only friend really is Jamie the dwarf, whom he's met a few people through, but not many. He grew up with Eric, but he went crazy now, so, you know. Frank got some supplies and drove his bike back home, and he spends the rest of the afternoon making bombs. He then says there are some cordite in the cellar, an explosive material from the war, and it's very explosive. His grandfather had it down there. Frank says he wants to get at it someday, but his father keeps tabs on the cordite and makes sure it's all there. Frank then says maybe he should dig through the back of the cellar and steal it one by one, but he can't. But someday he will, he says. Later, Frank and his father are eating dinner, and his father says they're looking for Eric at the moors, by the way. They think he's at the moors. Frank retorts, that would make sense, why they're looking for him there if they think he's there. His father then asks, how long is the cord of the telephone? Frank asks if he means when it's slacked or taut. His father just says, He then asks Frank if he wants anything from town when he gets groceries. Frank says, no, just his normal stuff. His dad says he needs to eat better. He eats like shit. He then asks if Frank plans on going out tonight. Frank says, no, not tonight, but tomorrow he's going to go to the bar with Jamie. His father says, go easy on the alcohol. You can always tell when he drinks too much from his farts. Frank explains that his father has another theory, like the Mobius strip one, that the mind and the bowels are linked. He once again writes to the London publishers with manuscripts about his theory, to which they always send them back. He finds it entertaining. He says, though, he can find out what you're eating or drinking by your farts, but also your mental state, if you're nervous or something like that. His father then warns Frank that he's seen better men than Frank end up in a gutter drunk off wine, so take it easy tomorrow night. Frank just says, it's my life, I'll do what I want, as he cleans his plate and leaves the room. That night, Frank watches TV and amends some of his maps of the island to show off the new Black Destroyer Hill, which, by the way, someone actually made a map of the island if you want to see it. It's right here on screen. He also thinks that he should bring a camera in his war bag from now on to document things. He also then talks about his past. Some of the boys in Port Nail ambushed him when he didn't have his war bag and hurt him pretty bad, so now that's why he keeps the war bag on him. He also makes some traps near the island so he won't be ambushed while he's at home. Things like razor blade bombs and Molotov cocktails and such, but he's never had to use them. He says he doesn't want to kill anyone anymore, but the stuff he carries is rather for defense now than offense. He then says he wants to buy a shotgun sometime too, or maybe a .22 rifle. Oh, what would it be like to live in America, he says. As he's making amends to the map, the phone rings. Frank goes downstairs quickly and answers it. He answers with his usual, Port Nail 531. Fuck it, Frank, how the hell are you, me bucko? Frank looks up and sees his father watching him answer the phone over the railing. Oh, hello there, Jamie. Why are you calling me this late? Oh, the old man's there, huh? Tell him he's a bag of pus for me. Frank looks up at his dad and says, Jamie says hello. His father just snorts and goes back to his room. Eric, where are you? Guess. I don't know. Glasgow? Whatever. Eric, are you eating well? Yeah, I'm eating dogs. No, you're not. Are you really? Are you at least cooking them? Of course I'm cooking them. What do you think I am? Is that all you're eating? Eric says no. He steals things from grocery stores and convenience stores like chips and cosmic brownies and such. Frank confusedly asks, why does he eat dogs when he steals all of that? Which Eric says he doesn't eat the stuff he steals, of course. He just steals it. Whatever. How are you sleeping? Oh, I'm not. You're not sleeping? No, Frank. You don't have to sleep. It's just something they tell you so that they can keep control over you. You are taught to sleep when you were a kid. You couldn't get over it if you're determined enough. You know, like a ship. What do you mean like a ship? I'll teach you when I get back. Frank then once again asks why he's bothering stealing dogs and eating them when he can just eat the stuff he steals from grocery stores. He says this in an annoyed tone, and as soon as he says it, he knows that Eric would take it the wrong way. They are dogs, Frank. It's not like I'm killing cats or goldfish. You don't have to shout. Don't have to shout? Don't have to shout? These are dogs, Frank. Don't you have any brains left? He hears Eric slamming the receiver as he's doing this. Eric, don't slam the receiver. And as you see here, I'm not making this up. He actually makes this noise. Frank just hangs up the phone and goes back to bed and tries to think of a name for his new slingshot. Like a ship? What a loony, Frank thinks to himself as he tries to sleep. The next chapter starts out with Frank saying he likens his brain to a sort of government. There are certain parts of his brains that are for certain ideas, and some parts of his brain that are against others. When he changes his mind, he thinks it's like a change in the minds of the people in his parliament or things like that. Then he just straight up randomly quotes, "Part of me's racist," which is just crazy to say. But then he says he knows there's no real reason for race hatred. There's no logical reason. His logical half of his brain knows that all the media about how colored people are guilty until proven innocent, and how awful and stupid that is. Then he says he sometimes wishes he could meet a colored person in town so he could walk up to them to show people, hey, look, I'm not racist. This book is something. That morning, though, he has a naming ceremony for his new slingshot. He christens it with belly button lint and toe cheese and his own blood to make it his own slingshot. A part of his brain government knows that it's dumb to do that, but it makes him feel powerful and in tune with his weapon, stronger. Frank goes for a run and finds his way to the bomb circle, as he calls it. He's out of breath and his chest is rising and falling because of his run. He then wonders what's it like to die. He then thinks about his mother, his father's second wife, Agnes. Frank says he doesn't remember his mother, but if he did, he'd hate her. She was the reason for his father's bum leg, Frank's disability, old Saul's death, and his father's reluctance to get Frank a motorcycle. She also let Eric get taken away from the island to live with her brother, because she didn't like that Frank's dad dressed up Eric like a girl in girl's clothes sometimes. But it's okay, because Frank killed Paul, his younger brother, and Agnes' youngest son, so it's even. Frank lied down in the bomb circle, the exact place where he killed Paul. He said that he knew he had to kill Paul from when he was very young. Paul couldn't stay alive, but he at least died as fast as a person could. He killed Paul when he was 8, and Paul was 5, 2 years after he killed his cousin Blythe. Blythe had plenty of time to realize he was dying, but Paul went instantly and humanely, Frank says. Frank and Paul were out walking one morning after a storm during low tide. Sometimes the sand would recede after the storms, and it was a pretty normal thing to walk during low tide in the sand after a storm. Frank was holding Paul's hand with no malice in his heart then. He and Paul were always friendly. Maybe because Frank knew that he wasn't long for this world, so he tried to make his time as pleasant as possible. They were running and Paul was jumping in tide pools, something he liked to do, when Frank saw something in the low tide. At first he thought it was a half-buried canoe or something, but when he walked up to it, he realized it was a bomb stood on its tail. Maybe from the war that didn't go off or something. He told Paul to come look at this. You see, this here is a bell. The things that make loud noises. Like after church breakfast? Paul asks. Frank says, yes, like after church breakfast. Frank says he wants Paul to hit it really hard with a stick so he can hear the sound. Frank is going to go stand on that dune 50 meters away and let Paul do it. Unless he's scared of the bell noise, of course. Paul says of course he isn't scared of the bell. He's not a baby. Paul asks if he can practice hitting it before he goes over, but Frank says no, the bell might get angry. Practice by hitting the tide pools instead. Frank runs over to the dune and waves for Paul when he's ready. Paul starts hitting it over and over, but nothing happens. Frank then puts his hand to his face. He didn't tell Paul where to hit it, he guesses. He thought about heading back down when Paul hits it right on the nose, and then suddenly, everything in a 10-foot radius just disappeared. Like evaporated. Sand flew all over with a large noise, but it was like things just disintegrated. The shockwave came out of it, sent Frank off the dune backwards, and when he got back up and looked at it from about 50 meters away, the hole was still steaming. He tried not to look too closely as to not see pieces of blood or clothing. Frank says nowadays he knows that it was a German HE-111 bomb, but that is why he named this place the Bomb Circle, in honor of his little brother. Like last time, no one suspected a thing. He had to act like he was horrified, and Eric and him cried together. He didn't tell Eric that he was the one that told Paul to do it, because he knew Eric wouldn't understand. Diggs questioned Frank at first, and he thought he might peg him at first as the culprit, but it was impossible for this to be seen as anything but an accident. After his run, though, Frank went back to his house for lunch after looking at the bomb circle. Mrs. Clamp was there, and they all discussed Diggs coming over the other day, but nothing was said about Eric. Night rolled around, and Frank decided to spend Saturday night at the bar with Jamie the dwarf. The first time we actually hear from Jamie. Jamie is on Frank's shoulders as they drink and listen to a punk band on stage called The Vomits. Jamie asks, "How's Frank doing? What's he been up to?" "Oh, nothing much. Killed a bunch of rabbits, got a few calls from Eric." Jamie asks, why is Eric calling him? Isn't he in the hospital? Frank says, "No, has Jamie not heard?" Eric escaped. Christ, is he still setting fire to dogs and whatnot? Frank says he doesn't know, but he kinda hopes he makes it back home after his escape. He misses him. Jamie asks if Frank thinks that the police will catch Eric or not. Frank says that, well, Eric is insane, but he's not stupid. He's extremely cunning. Jamie says, well, he just hopes Eric doesn't cause any aggro. They then get some more drinks and go up near stage, and Jamie goes back on Frank's shoulders, and people start dancing. Frank says he doesn't mind dancing with women if it's to be Jamie's wingman, except this one time when he had to dance with this really tall girl and her boobs were in his face. It made him want to throw up. Frank left the stage and tried to steady himself from all the alcohol in a corner with Jamie as the band finished. A girl walked up to them, and it was some punk girl, and her and Jamie talked about bikes as Frank just sat there with Jamie on his shoulders. Jamie says, oh, he's gonna get a 250 soon. Frank says that's not true because Jamie wouldn't even be able to reach the pedals even if he did. But most men say anything to impress a girl, Frank says. The girl retorts in a heavy Western Scottish accent about some stuff, and they continue to talk about motorcycles for like 30 minutes. Frank says he starts to see trails and after images and starts to feel sick after a while. Jamie and the girl just continue to talk though. Eventually, Jamie asks if he's going to go walk home with them. Frank says, yeah, he agrees against his better judgment, and leaves with them and starts walking. As soon as he walks out the door, he knows he should have used the toilet before he left. His gut's churning. Some evil part of his brain keeps thinking about fried eggs, and it made him even more nauseous. The punk girl and Jamie were on either side of Frank, and they were letting him lean on him as he stammered along, pissed drunk and nauseous. They just continued to talk, and Frank thought about how he had to pee. Really bad. He had to say something to them right now or he was going to get sick all over them. Frank tries to communicate, but they just keep bumping into him and make him feel sicker. Oh no, this is it. He has to say something. He turns to Jamie and the girl, and he says that he enunciates very clearly in his throat and says, I didn't know if you two ever shared, or indeed still do share for that matter, for all that I know, at least mutually between yourselves, but at any rate not including me, the misconception I once perchance to place upon the words contained upon yonder sign, but in fact that I thought the union referred to in said nomenclature delineated an association of working people, and it did seem to me at the time to be quite some socialist thing for the town fathers to call a street. It struck me that all was not yet lost as regards to the prospects for a yet possible peace, or at the very least a ceasefire in the class war, if such acknowledgments of the worth of trade unions could find their way onto such a venerable and important thoroughfare sign. But I must admit I was disabused of this sadly over-optimistic notion when my father, God rest his sense of humor, informed me that the then recently conformed union of the English and Scottish parliaments, the local worthies, in common with hundreds of other town councils throughout what had until a point had been independent realm, were celebrating with such solemnity, and perchance doubtless with the view of opportunities for profit which this early form of takeover bid offered. To which Jamie and the punk girl look at each other and basically say, what the fuck did he just say? I thought this part was very funny. They continue talking about bikes to Frank's dismay, and then he felt it. He broke free from their grasp and ran as fast as he could down the street. He turns a corner and finds a gas station, squats and pisses behind a pump. Jamie catches up a few seconds later out of breath and asks, Why? Why did you do that? Frank just says, sorry, as he thinks about fried eggs again and throws up behind the pump. Jamie puts his hand on his friend's back as he heaves over and over. Feel better now? He asks. Why didn't you say something? Frank says he tried, but he was too drunk. Jamie laughs and offers to go home to see his mom for a bit. Sober up and drink some tea, you know. They do so, and Jamie's mom dotes over Frank a bit, and then he leaves more sober, filled with tea at about 1 a.m. He walks home and remembers a time when he saw either the Northern Lights on a night like this, or something like that. He says some part of him might have thought that they were UFOs, but it was more likely that they were gas lights over oil rigs or the Northern Lights. He gets home and thinks his house looks much bigger at night in this moonlight, a house staring out at the sea. And on this night, Frank joined it. The next chapter starts out with Frank saying that he killed Esmeralda, his cousin. He said that he owed it to the world as he killed 2 boys, he needed to kill a girl. He said he didn't dislike her or anything, but he did this more or less on a whim. He then says, quote, children aren't real people anyway. He says they don't become real people until society's evil influence corrupts them. They are sexless and likable as beings before they become quote-unquote people. She was the daughter of Harmsworth and Morag Stove. I refuse to believe those are real names. Harmsworth and Morag. It sounds like a League of Legends champion. Those 2 are Frank's half-uncle and half-aunt, the 2 that took care of Eric from the age of 3 till 5. The 2 parents didn't mind letting Esmeralda visit Frank because he seemed like a well-adjusted child. No one suspected him for the 2 other murders. Frank says that he looked so innocent because of his seemingly clear conscience. He even tried to appear guilty, quote, for the wrong reason. He tried to act like he felt like, if only I could have done something, and it made him look more innocent. Anyway, Frank decided to murder little Esmeralda before they even visited. He had to even up the balance. That year, Frank had a phase where he liked to make and fly kites. It was 1973. That summer they were all there, and Frank took Esmeralda flying kites a lot. He let her play with the small kites all summer. One day later, they were on the dunes flying kites. As they were, Frank hatched his plan. Frank built a giant kite, like a tournament-sized one. He built it with wood and magazine and tent cloth and nylon rope. Esmeralda would pick flowers while he did this. After a while, though, it was done. Frank called her over to the dune like any other day flying kites, and he showed her this big kite, and she was impressed. She had a fistful of flowers and puts one in Frank's breast pocket. She oohed and ahed at the big kite. He gave the control lines over to Esmeralda, and then he wrapped the strings around her arms and knots and such. Because of course it was so big, and he didn't want her to have to let go of it, of course. The kite was strong. So she didn't even question it. He ran to the kite after he tied it to her, and then he kicked the kite up into the air. And it didn't even take that much force. The wind took it hard. It shook and cracked with a thunderous noise, and Frank ran up behind Esmeralda and helped her with the lines just in case someone was watching. Then all of a sudden, a snap as the line ran out of slack. Frank let go, and she raised into the air, and she tried to let go of the rope, but it didn't let go of her. She rose up and up and up as she screamed, and Frank then tried to run after her, once again just in case someone was watching. The kite was so high now that Frank thought legitimately she might get over the whole North Sea. He watched her get smaller and smaller and smaller in the distance, and then left go back home. Frank knew that 3 whole deaths near him would be suspicious, but he had a plan. He took time and sat by himself for a bit. He rubbed sand in his eyes and walked up to an area where a worker found him hours later. He must have looked in a horrible state, he says, crying and playing with the flowers that Esmeralda had given him. Frank pretended to not even notice the worker when he walked up to him, staring right past him. Dozens of people eventually came up to Frank, but he took no notice of any of them. Someone eventually took him home after a search party was started for Esmeralda. Frank's father undressed him and put him into bed, and his aunt and uncle shook him trying to get answers, but he pretended to not even notice them. Pretended to be catatonic. A police officer stayed in his room all night. He thinks it might have been Diggs, but he doesn't know. He pretended to fall asleep and then wake up scream as if he wasn't able to stay asleep because of the nightmares. But eventually morning came, Frank not having slept, and they turned up with no Esmeralda. It took Frank a week to quote-unquote recover. He just started to talk again after 3 days, but only in disjointed sentences. He had nightmares that entire week, he told people, until he finally was able to tell people that He thought he was jinxed. 3 deaths in the vicinity of him. He thought he brought death and destruction wherever he went. It was all fake, of course. Acting. But everyone believes him. He had to burn all of his kites to keep up the act of feeling guilty. But that's how he evened up the score. After the events of last Saturday night, he spent the whole day in bed. His father walked in and asked, "What's wrong with you?" As if he even needs to ask. Frank says, "Nothing." His father just says, "Uh-huh. And how much did you drink last night, Frank?" Frank says, "Not much, but he'll go down for dinner soon." His father then asks, "Was that you on the phone last night, putting on a funny voice?" Frank immediately realizes that it was Eric, and he says, "I don't remember if I did or not. Honest." His father just says, "You're a fool," and leaves. Frank goes downstairs in his nightgown and sits at the table. He says, "Sorry, Dad. I did get a bit drunk last night. I'm sorry if that upsets you." His dad calls him a fool and a loser. He asks if he knows how many brain cells he probably killed off. Frank says he doesn't know. Frank then farts, and his father sniffs the air and goes, "Whiskey and lager." How does he do that? Frank thinks. Frank goes back to bed when the phone rings, and he goes downstairs and answers it. "Yes?" He answers breathlessly. "No." "What? You said yes?" "I said no." "Fine. Hello, Eric." "Goodbye." The phone hangs up, and Frank just looks at the phone in confusion and anger. And then the phone rings again. "Get Portnail 531. Portnail 531. "Come on, Eric. I recognize your voice." Then there's 2 pages of Eric and Frank talking back and forth about how Frank says his name is Frank, then Eric says his name is Eric, and Frank is actually Eric. It's a huge thing. It's really confusing. To me, Eric reminds me a lot of Trevor Phillips from GTA 5, if you need a visual for that. The conversation continues. "How are you anyway?" "Don't act like you care." "Of course you do. You're my brother." Eric then screams into the phone, and Frank's dad comes down and looks at Frank accusingly. "Well, there you are," Frank says, trying to pretend it's Jamie again. "It's just Jamie again, Dad." His father tells him don't spend too long on the phone. Then a huge thing ensues on the phone of Frank hearing a dog on the other end as well. Frank yells and screams for Eric to let it go, and in his confusion, the dog gets away. Eric screams and puts more money in, but Frank hangs up, happy the dog got away. Eric would get over it. Frank thinks he has to think of a solution to this problem. Eric cannot keep doing this. He would have to consult the factory about this tomorrow. The next chapter is a little bit of backstory about Eric, Frank, their dad, and their mom. Agnes Caldham came home one day, 8.5 months pregnant, on her BSA 500 with extended handlebars and the Eye of Sauron painted on the front. Eric was staying with the Stoves at the time, and Frank was 3 at the time, so he doesn't remember anything. And he has only heard the story from Mrs. Clamp. Agnes got back to the island and was convinced that she had to give birth in the lotus position, which is also the way that Paul was conceived, according to her at least. And at the time, Frank was apparently enamored by Old Sol and didn't pay any attention to his own mother, the dog whose skull was mentioned earlier. The dog was an ancient white bulldog, blind and deaf. The dog hated women, motorcycles, and Agnes in general, so when she came rolling up that one day and the dog came running to her, barking, Agnes, being the peaceful hippie that she was, kicks Saul so hard in the face that he goes running over to the dunes in pain to Frank in the vegetable garden. Agnes, meanwhile, goes upstairs to give birth, going and pushing. Mrs. Clamp there trying to help deliver Paul, and Frank's dad in the room panicking too. All of them then heard an extreme amount of screams and a dog barking from outside. They freaked out and went to go look, except for Agnes, who was still giving birth, at what happened in the vegetable garden with Old Sol. Frank's father ran down to the vegetable garden and grabbed the injured young Frank, now a eunuch. So yes, the injury alluded to in the entire book so far that happened to Frank, and the source of his disability, is Old Sol biting off Frank's penis. Frank's father, after an hour of dressing Frank's shattered crotch and drugging him and putting him to sleep, went to go find Old Sol and put him down with a shotgun. He found the dog shivering in the cellar, and according to his father, he decided to strangle the dog instead of shooting the old thing. And at the exact same time the dog died, a scream lashed out from upstairs. Paul being born the exact moment that Saul died. It would appear that Paul was named after Saul, the name just being 1 letter off. 2 days after the birth, Agnes left on her motorcycle, not even staying long enough to be with her new son for a whole week. Frank's father tries to stop her, but she runs over his leg, causing his leg injury. His father sets his own leg, doing it not quite right and making him crippled for life. And that was the last time any of them saw Agnes, ever. Frank never seeing his mom again. Angus called him, Frank's dad, never seeing his wife again. She left 1 dead, 2 crippled for life, and 1 new birth. Not a bad score, Frank thinks. Frank asks his father what happened to his genitals, and his father says he cut Saul open and took them, but he refuses to tell Frank what he did with them. Frank then says that Saul, obviously, got reborn as Paul. That's why he killed him, to even the score with the bomb circle. Then later, he got Saul's skull to use divination and stuff on it. So Frank says that his enemy is twice dead, and he still has his skull. The score is even for his penis, even if he's left less of a man for it. Then humorously, right after all of this, he says, burning dogs is nonsense. Frank starts the next chapter by, of course, saying some strange shit. He says that he used to do mean things to birds before he realized that they were his allies in this world. He would sometimes shoot them or shank them with a knife when he got close. Sometimes he would put pipe bombs under their nests. Sometimes he would tie the 2 of them together after he threw some breadcrumbs for them, and then he would kill one of the birds tied to the other. That way the living one would live in a living hell attached to the carcass of another bird, unable to get free. He tells this story because he's pedaling to the bar next day when birds shat on his bike, which he named Gravel, by the way. He and Jamie then talk in the bar for a little bit, and Jamie asks once again how they haven't caught Eric. Frank says Eric's crazy, but he's not stupid. Jamie asks if he's sure his brother's crazy. Frank says, well, that's what they say, but he doesn't know. Jamie retorts that, no, Eric's crazy. He's mad at the world, the man, them, quote unquote. Frank says, yeah, maybe he's right. Maybe everyone in his family's crazy. Jamie says, yeah, he can say that again. Frank says, yeah, his dad's an eccentric. Eric is, well, Eric. And Frank himself is pretty weird, he admits. They start then playing Space Invaders, and Jamie says, well, sometimes the crazy ones are the best survivors. Survival of the nastiest. Frank goes home and sees his dad on the lawn, but just ignores him and goes inside the house. And the next couple days pass without incident. No calls from Eric. During those days, Frank builds dams and lets them break. He explains his philosophy about patterns and how they can be used to recognize the future, hence why he uses divination to figure out the future, whether that be with Old Saul's skull or the Wasp Factory itself. And no, we still don't know what the point of the Wasp Factory is or what it is in general, but don't worry, the next chapter will tell us all about it. The next day, Frank wakes up ready to consult the factory. He takes a sleepy wasp in a jar that he had caught days ago. He cleans his hands and brings the wasp into the factory and got ready for it. First, though, he has to go through the proper preparations, of course. He takes the powerful items and lays them in front of himself and recites his catechisms. The items being the skull of the snake that killed Blythe, a piece of the bomb that killed Paul, a piece of the cloth with the same cloth that made the kite that killed Esmeralda, and finally a tooth from the skull of Old Saul. He holds his crotch and recites his catechisms, which he has memorized at this point, of course. And then he looks at the sea chart and the weather. He has to make sure things were perfect for the Wasp Factory. And then without further ado, he lets the wasp into the Wasp Factory. The following pages are a detailed description of what the Wasp Factory is, and I have drawn a crude drawing on screen of what I understand it is, at least. First and foremost, it, like the bunker and Old Saul's skull, is a divination device, a way Frank can tell the future or things that are happening at this current moment. Frank says he once went to the dump and found a face of a big clock, one that once hung on the outside of a building. This face of the clock he repurposed for the base of the Wasp Factory, and attached to this clock face is 12 tubes that make passageways for the wasps, each one corresponding to one of the Roman numerals of the clock, and each one of those tubes leads to another way for the wasp to be tortured and killed. The way the wasp is tortured somehow indicates to Frank that something is going to happen in the future, or is happening right now. For example, earlier in the book, Frank mentions the Wasp Factory indicated fire, which Frank says is the 12 Roman numeral. It always has been. It represents Paul, fire, midday, things like that. Each of the 12 corridors kills a wasp in a different way. It's sort of like a fucked up tarot card set. Frank says that most of the deaths are automatic, but some require what he calls the coup de grace, where he has to finish the wasp off in some way. Some of the deaths he describes are just needlessly vicious. One of them is a chamber where the wasp gets stuck, and attached to the chamber is an air gun, which Frank has to pull the trigger to kill the wasp. One of them is a spider's den, where the wasp gets stuck in a spider's web and slowly gets eaten. Another chamber houses a Venus flytrap. Another is an ant farm, where fire ants overrun the wasp until it eventually succumbs to its wounds. One is something he calls the gents, which is just him drowning the wasp in his own pee. One where the wasp gets crushed. One where it's chopped up by blades. One is a vacuum that sucks all of the oxygen out and fills it with carbon dioxide. One is a bunch of spikes that electrocute the wasp over and over until it dies. He also has a room with poisoned food for the wasp as well. In addition, he has one where a rubber band launches a needle and skewers the wasp through the thorax. And finally, the Lake of Fire, which is where the wasp gets dropped into a bath of petrol and Frank has to click a lighter, which the past 2 attempts have been this one. This time, the wasp goes in the factory, and Frank puts a picture of Eric up to the glass so the wasp can see it, of course. Then, he waits to see what the wasp will do. Which chamber? And for the 3rd time in a row, the wasp goes through the tube to the Lake of Fire. He lights the lighter on the first try, and the wasp burns. That's 3 in a row. It can't be a coincidence, Frank thinks. The factory indicated fire once again. Frank sighs and pushes his hair back. He knew this wasn't a good sign. He took everything apart and shelved the Wasp Factory once again. The sun now coming up, and he knew he had to try something else. He goes down to the bunker and tries to make contact with Eric through Saul's skull. He lights the candles in the dog's skull, and Frank sits down and closes his eyes very hard. He tries to picture Eric's face, and then he puts one finger hard in his eyes and one on Saul's head, trying to use it as like a medium or something for Eric. He sees swirling patterns like you do when you close your eyes too hard, and finally he thinks he sees something. But then a burst of fire from the candle takes Frank out of it. He was right there, he thinks. He could feel Eric, but now his hands were tingling from the fire and the pressure he put on his forehead and his eyes. He saw Eric. He felt him. He felt his bloodlust. Eric was in a total war with something, perhaps himself. Frank was sure of it. He felt Eric. He then gets up and cleans up the bunker and leaves. Eric spends the rest of the day in the house, reading and thinking about his personal mythology with the factory and all of that. 3 fires? That can't be a coincidence. Frank's dad is using ladders and stuff to paint the house outside and actually let Frank make dinner for once, which was strange to him. After they finished, his dad got up and said he's going into town. He looked really tired from his day of painting though. He says he won't be late, so don't bother locking up. Then he asks if Frank will be okay tonight, and Frank says yeah, don't worry about him. His dad leaves and Frank watches him go over the bridge. Frank is tired though and takes a nap after dinner and is awoken by a phone call. He puts the phone up to his ear expecting to hear Eric's voice, but it's just Jamie. He says that he dropped a board on his foot at work today, so he's gonna go get some quote-unquote anesthetic from the bar if Frank knows what he means, and if he wants to join. Frank says, not tonight, he's tired. Jamie says, okay. Did you get any calls from you-know-who? Frank says, actually, he hasn't gotten any calls recently from him. Jamie says, okay, get some sleep, and hangs up. Frank puts the phone down, and it immediately rings again. Did you forget something? Forget? Forget? I didn't forget anything. I remember everything. Why are you accusing me of forgetting things? I haven't forgotten anything, Eric said, spitting and sputtering in rage. Eric, sorry. I thought you were somebody else. I thought you were Jamie. That dwarf? You bastard! What do you mean, that dwarf, in that tone? Jamie's my friend. It's not his fault he's small. How do you know that? How do I know what? He was born that way. That's just what he says. Maybe he's an alien. Maybe he's actually big for his race. Frank and Eric go back and forth for a bit, when Eric says that actually he's doing better than he was. He's still on his way though. He actually broke into a couple's vacation home and it's like a luxury house. It's really nice. Frank freaks out because his brother's broken into someone else's house, obviously. And then he asks, did you feel something this morning, Eric? Like some sort of communication or someone in your body? Eric says, no. It's strange because usually his mornings are very eventful, you know, eating dogs and all that, but this morning was really peaceful. Frank presses harder and harder, trying to get a reaction out of Eric, trying to get him to admit that he felt something, until Eric says, anyway, Frank, old sport, this is getting boring. I might call you again soon, but I'll see you real soon. Ta-ta. Then the line goes dead. Frank angrily slams the receiver down and it chimes as he hits it, and he gives it an accusatory glance and goes back to bed. where he watches an awful American crime drama as he falls asleep. This next chapter is finally called What Happened to Eric? So yes, we find out this chapter what made Eric go crazy, effectively. The chapter starts with Frank saying that he went to go see Jamie the next morning and drank some stuff with him. After which, he went on a walk to a group of hills to the north of Portnail. He says he likes to get away from the island sometimes. Not that far, but far enough so he can see the whole island at a distance. He says it puts things in perspective. It makes him know that he is inexperienced in this world, and he's okay with that. He knows his limitations. He's learned from Eric's example. For Eric went away when he was old enough. Eric, being extremely smart and kind and sensitive, went away one day. That path led him to the destruction of his own mind. But Frank loves Eric, and Eric loves Frank, despite his disability. Eric left the island before Frank was even born, because of Agnes, but he would spend holidays and summers on the island with Frank. Frank would follow his big brother around like a puppy, and Eric, being too kind to tell Frank to stop in fear of hurting his feelings, let him. They would play war and stuff like that, and Eric would always pretend to stay behind and die for his comrades in the war, dying for his little brother. This would make Frank even cry, even if he knew it wasn't real. He knew Eric would die for anyone. He was just that kind of guy. When Eric would have migraines, Frank would be upset that they couldn't play together. He would bring Eric cold drinks in his dark room when he would get them. Frank would suffer with Eric, as when Eric hurt, Frank hurt. Eventually, though, like all men, Frank says, Eric wanted to be an adult and see the world, and that made him fully leave home one day. He had an outward urge to help people, like his father, and he wanted to become a doctor. He told Frank that things wouldn't change, because he would still be home for summers, so it wouldn't be any different. But Frank knew that wasn't true. After a year of extremely good grades, Eric came back for the summer, but things were not the same. Eric was now an adult, just entertaining Frank. He was no longer a kid that shared in the play and fun, but now the adult that was humoring a child. At least that's how Frank felt. A few years later, something happened, which unbeknownst to Frank and his father was compounded with a bunch of other more troubled things that Eric was going through, and it broke Eric. He was still that wise, wordy man, but now he had that old personality back, but satanically reversed, almost. An amalgamation of all of his personalities. The big thing that happened in Eric's second year in a big teaching hospital. That day, he had broken up with a girlfriend and he was very upset about it, but that wasn't all. You see, Eric was in the basement of the hospital that day, where the deformed children were. They were in there to be kept alive in the hospital through special care and machines and such. The type of deformities that would more than likely kill them if they weren't with the special equipment in the hospital. And they didn't even last in the hospital, let alone outside it. Eric and a lot of nurses even seemed to think that it was inhumane keeping these children alive in so much pain, just to be some sick experiment on how long you can keep a person alive when their own body worked against them. Eric was helping a child with a particular deformity that made him more or less a vegetable. Some of the boy's disabilities included him not being able to talk, and he only made grunts. He couldn't control his muscles properly, and his head had to be supported with a brace, and his skull was supported with a metal plate because the bones didn't grow over his brain properly. Even the skin over his brain was paper thin. Every few hours he had to be fed, and this time it was Eric who had to feed him. He was doing so, and the child was being strangely quiet. His eyes had glazed over in an almost peaceful expression. The child refused to eat though, something he usually took great joy in doing. Eric kept trying to feed the child as a migraine started coming on for him. He spoke to the child quietly to try to get the child to look at him at least, something he usually did, but he didn't. Eric checked this kid's medication and all seemed normal. Eric tried again with a spoon with that migraine getting worse. Then he saw something. Some small movement, barely noticeable on the boy's shaved head. It was small and very slow. He looked around the metal skull cap and lifted it easily on the boy, and that's when he saw it. A worker ran into the room after they heard Eric scream, and the worker found Eric curled up in a fetal position in the corner, crying and howling to himself. The chair with the child had been tipped over and the child was still in it, just smiling away. The worker got close to the child and vomited from what he saw. A ward sister came in after the worker, and maybe she just had an extremely strong stomach, or had seen it all, but she picked the boy up from the floor and put him right and covered his head with a towel. Flies had gotten into the ward that day somehow, because it was a hot and humid day. They had somehow gotten under the child's skull plate and laid eggs. Eric had lifted up the plate and saw it all. In addition to how horrible the child's life was before, he saw a mass of writhing maggots and bloody gray matter as they consumed the brain of the child, all while his migraine was destroying him from his own brain. A combination of that inhumane sight, his migraine, the day of his breakup, and this poor child's life who he thought shouldn't be kept alive, broke his mind. Later that night, he was sedated and seemed to slightly recover, but he was quieter. Eric went back to classes, but people noticed that he was a little off. He started drinking heavily and showing up to the wrong classes and started getting confused all the time. He started screaming in his sleep. He started trying drugs to cope with the pain, and he started missing more and more classes. And in the end, the university suggested he left the university. Eric didn't take that well. He took all of his books and burned them in the hallway. The university took leniency on him after the whole ordeal with the child, and he was very lucky that they did. But they just sent Eric home. But when he got back to the island, he obviously was very changed. He refused to talk. He got banned from all 4 bars in Portnail for swearing at other customers. Their father almost stopped talking, having to deal with Eric around that time too. All he would do was watch TV all day and smoke cigarettes. After which, Eric would go outside and set fire to dogs and scare children by putting maggots in his own mouth and showing kids it. Eventually, a dog went missing and Diggs had to come talk to Eric. Eric then went missing for 5 days, and 3 more missing dogs later, Eric came home covered in petrol and burned clothes. Their dad called Diggs that night, and he was certified insane days later. He supposedly quieted down for a while in the mental hospital, but now he is back on his way to the island. Frank thought about all of this while looking at the island from a distance. He went home that night and ate his normal food, to which he picked the food out of his teeth with a match. The next day, Frank says it bothered him how his brother went crazy, but it wasn't like he was sane one second and insane the next. It was gradual. Frank saw it as it happened. The smiling child was a trigger, though, he says. A part of him couldn't accept that God existed in a world with someone like that, suffering every second with flies in their brain. How could something supposedly be created in God's image suffer as bad as that child had? Frank then says that, unlike men, women suffer from one tragedy, like sexual abuse or death, and they fall to pieces. Frank says of course there are a few strong women, ones with more man in them than others, but Frank figures that Eric had a little too much woman in him. God damn it, Frank. Frank says he blames 2 people for Eric's break. First, his own father, who let him dress up in women's clothes when he was a child. And 2, the woman who broke his heart the day that he saw that child, and made it all the more worse. Frank then says he hopes his father blames himself as much as Frank blames him. Eric didn't call that last night after Frank looked at the island on the hill. He went to bed early. This morning, though, he went to the dump, a place he likes to go and where he found most of the pieces for the Wasp Factory. He likes that place because it's ever-changing and huge. After a while, he picked over some stuff in the dump and blew up some aerosol cans in it, and then he headed south on a walk. After a long walk, he saw a nice big home. He looked through the binoculars and saw that no one was in it, and then he heard a noise. A horrible howling. An animal. God, he hoped it was an animal at least. He hoped that no human could ever make that noise. It was a horrible, tormented screech. It was an anguish, an extremis. A noise that you hoped no living thing could ever make. Over the ridge, he saw a black shape move quickly. He pulled out his binoculars and tracked the animal as it skidded and turned, yelping high-pitched yips. He ran down to where the animal was a second ago and saw a patch of flattened grass that was on fire, and he stomped it out. He walked over to the stream and saw the dog lying in the stream. Still alive, but its fur mostly gone. Its skin exposed underneath, and it was leaking and seeping. The dog quivered, and Frank could only see one unburned eye. He got a hint of a burn smell, and he felt vomit settle in his throat right under his Adam's apple. Frank takes out his slingshot, pulls it back, and releases, putting the dog out of its misery. Its head flies back as blood flows from its hole near its eye. "Frank'll get you," he whispers. Something he thought people said about him in town to keep their children away from interacting with Frank. A rumor spread that Frank was just like Eric. "Frank'll get you." Frank drags the body out of the stream, gagging as he does so, and he digs a hole and buries the dog in it. He stomps out the rest of the fires and heads home without incident. He gets in the bathtub and drinks a glass of orange juice. He was sure that he had just missed Eric. Just missed. He goes to the kitchen table and saw his dad sitting there with the newspaper. Hot one today, huh? Frank says. Mm-hmm. His father replies. There was a fire down by the new house on the beach, and I put it out, Frank says. His father just says, well, it's the weather for it, and he turns a page in the paper. On the bottom of the page, Frank sees an article about a holiday home going up in flames on it. The phone rings and his father gets up to answer it. It's for you, Frank, he says. Frank gets up and answers the phone.
Hello, is this Frank?
Said in a weird accent. Yes, hello?
Frankie boy,
Eric shouts on the other end.
Here I am in your thorax of the woods, still eating old hot dogs. So tell me, how are you, bucko? Stars going okay for you? What sign are you again?
Canis. What sign are you?
Cancer,
He screams. Benign or malignant, Frank jokes.
Malignant. I've got crabs at the moment.
Frank takes his ear away from the phone as Eric guffaws on the other end.
How are things going? How's things? How's am I hanging? How's it going? And yourself?
Eric goes on and on like this. Eric,
To bed? To sleep? Perchance to masturbate? Ah, have a good old rub.
Eric, will you shut up? Frank Stream whispers.
What?
Eric says in a hurt voice. The dog. I saw the dog today.
What dog?
Eric says perplexed. Don't fuck with me, Eric. I saw the dog near the house.
What dogs?
No more dogs. You are too close. Leave them alone. I'm serious, Eric. Believe it.
Believe what? What are you talking about?
You heard me, Frank says as he slams the receiver. Frank goes back upstairs. Frank's father comes out and asks what that was about. Frank says it was just Jamie, putting on a stupid voice. The next morning, Frank wakes up sweating under his duvet. A particularly hot and dry day. He gets up and goes downstairs and watches Saturday morning television as his father makes him breakfast. Frank eats it and then goes out to check his poles. They were fine, other than having to replace some of the mouse heads on them. After which he goes home, where Mrs. Clamp is making lunch. Frank asks how she's doing, and she says just fine. They eat in silence, as Miss Clamp says, I heard a dog went missing a couple days ago. Frank looked up and says, well, good thing Eric isn't around, or he'd be blamed. She looks at him through narrowed eyes and just continues eating. To break up the silence, Frank just says, I put out a wee fire by the beach. Frank's dad just tells him to stop bragging as they finish their meal. The meal had vastly improved Frank's mood that day, and he went to the dunes and looked around with his binoculars. He looked all around and then focused back on the house. He sees his dad exasperately open the front door and run outside of it. He was not in his town clothes, and Frank thought that was strange. He didn't mention going to town today either, something he would always tell Frank. Frank watches as his dad disappears over the bridge, and Frank jumps back down off the dunes and goes back inside. He looks and sees a ton of whiskey glasses and a bottle. He had drank a lot before he left, Frank thinks. Frank looks around and sees the phone hanging from its cord, and the tone playing over and over. Frank puts it back on the receiver and then puts two and two together. Oh shit, Frank's father must have been there when Eric called. His dad must have run to town after hearing Eric to get some more alcohol at the bar, once he had run out here. Frank now knows he has to be ready for today. He goes upstairs and goes to the loft and looks over the island. He then thinks to go after his father, and then he locks up and leaves the house. But then he thinks Eric wouldn't find them in town, he'd go directly to the house. So he goes right back inside. Frank curses himself that he was so mean to Eric last time on the phone. He probably decided it was finally time to come home when he was so mean to him. Shit! Frank says to himself. He thought that Eric would wait till nighttime though, so he sits down on his bed and waits. The afternoon turned to evening, and then at 6 p.m., the phone rang.
Frank?
Frank felt the contempt in his own voice. Yes, father.
Frank, son. I'm in town, son. You know I've always loved you. I'm calling from town, son. Want you to come here. They caught Eric, son.
Frank froze. His father asked if he was there as Frank just sits motionless looking at the wallpaper. Frank's dad slurs his words and says to meet him at the library. Frank questions this and wonders why the library. He asks why, and his father says, Right, see you there, son. And the phone hangs up. Frank questions this, though. He goes upstairs and closes the windows and turns off the radio. His legs were really hurting today. He wonders if he's been overdoing things. He starts walking to town, and then he notices a bunch of birds gathered around the Church of Scotland in town. He goes up to pull his binoculars, but then he realizes he left them at home. He walks over to the church and realizes that the phone line was down, very recently cut. The electricity's still sparking out of it. Something then clicks in Frank's head. Oh, you lying bastard. Frank turns around and slams his feet into the ground, going as fast as he can back to the island. He goes home and checks the phone. It was dead. He knew it. The sheer audacity of his old man trying to lure him away from the house because he was too frightened to face Eric. He might have gotten away with it if he didn't hear the sheer mendacity in his voice. Frank laughs to himself, and he says, I drink too much. Frank goes downstairs to eat while he waits for his brother again. He eats an apple, half a cheese wheel, and some bread. Dude eats like a fucking Skyrim NPC. He then goes back up and stares over the horizon with his binoculars. He thought that, in this light, no one would see Eric approach him but him from here. No vigilantes who wanted to apprehend the dog killer would find him if he came at this time of night. Frank then went back downstairs and prepared a bag just in case he had to run to meet Eric somewhere. He kept glancing at the phone, but he knew it wouldn't ring. Frank grabbed some painkillers in case Eric had a migraine and needed some relief, and he grabbed some real food for him amongst other things. He puts it all in a canvas bag and goes back upstairs to watch over the horizon. Frank yawns as clouds roll in. He wakes up hours later to a loud noise in the kitchen. Frank looks at his clock. 11 p.m. Fuck! He slept for hours. He started downstairs very slowly, timidly. He curses himself for being so scared of his own brother. He gets to the corner of the stairs and smells a strong whiskey smell. Oh, it must be his father, he thinks. He breathes a sigh of relief. Frank? His father calls out. Frank stays still, but he doesn't know why, but he felt like a deer in the headlights. He slowly walks back to his room and he hears his dad yell his name again and pound on the first floor bathroom, and then swear when he realizes it wasn't locked. His dad walks up the stairs and knocks on Frank's door as he stumbles a bit. Frank? Oh, fuck. He'd never heard his father swear before. It sounded dirty in his mouth, not like when Eric or Jamie would curse. It sounded unnatural. His footsteps walked away from Frank's door when his father figured he wasn't home. Frank waits 5 minutes and gets up. He went downstairs, turned off the TV, and saw his father's tweed jacket on the kitchen chair. He looks in the pockets, and he finally finds them. The keys to his father's study. He runs up the stairs 3 at a time, and opens the door to the study. He turns on the light, and inside it's messy. Chemistry apparatuses and papers on the desk, and in that desk was a locked drawer, along with several copies of The Wizard of Oz and It, for some reason. And then he saw it. A specimen jar. Inside, a tiny set of male genitalia. Frank's mind spun. What could it mean? He felt a lump in his throat and wondered what the secret was here. And then all of a sudden, it clicked. His father's name. Angus. His father's lightly hairy arms. His feminine features. Him dressing up Eric like a girl, and everything just fit. Frank wanted to cry, but he told himself he wasn't a stupid girl. He tried desperately to remember if he'd seen his father naked from the waist down ever, but nothing came up. He felt sick, but he unlocked the desk to see if that was the only secret, and inside, his suspicions were confirmed. Inside the desk was a box of male hormones and tampons, and a short story about hippies and aliens. And the hormones had the letters KBR on them. Sidebar, that's never brought up again, and I don't know what KBR means. Frank, feeling sick, grabs the specimen jar and tampons. He unsheaths his knife and runs to his father's room. Frank will get you, he says under his breath. He storms into his father's room and shoves the knife right next to his nose just so it misses him. Frank? Frank shoves a box of tampons and hormones in his father's face. You're gonna tell me, or by God. He let the words hang as he shoves his knife closer to his father's neck. Frank goes down and starts to unbutton his father's pants. Please. I'm sorry. It was just an experiment. Please don't hurt me. You bitch. You bitch! Frank screams. He pulls his father's underwear down and a loud noise rings out, like the cry of a dog on fire from the other day. But it was magnified and repeated. Frank looks and his father's greasy genitalia were out. Frank confusedly looks towards the noise now. He gets up and looks out the window. And on the dunes, several sheep crescendo over the top of them. all on fire, baaing and whining from the pain. And several dogs doing the exact same thing. And then he saw him. Among the smoke was a skinny figure dancing over the dunes, with an axe in his hand and a burning stick in the other. Frank's father slowly rises up and looks out the window. "Oh God, no," his father screams. Frank yells at his father to follow him as they rush down the stairs outside. Pools of flesh that melted off sheep lie around with a horrible smell. Guttural baaing coming from all directions. It was disorienting. But he saw his brother go down the steps through the smoke and bash into the cellar door with an axe. Frank runs at him, and as he does, he notices that the shed is on fire from a sheep. But that had to wait. He yells for his dad to get out of the house, and he runs at Eric. Eric swings the axe at his brother and barely misses Frank, and he rolls out of the way. "Eric, stop!" He raised his slingshot and put Eric's head in his crosshairs. Eric breaks down the door and drops the stick of fire and smiles at Frank, who leers at him, under a dirty beard and shit all over his face. He walks towards Frank, expecting him to shoot him with the slingshot, but Frank can't do it. He lowers it, and Eric walks away. He drops the axe and just walks away. Frank looks into the cellar and he thinks he can see all the cordite, but the flaming stick is nowhere near it. He picks it up, and as he does, the shed explodes from the pipe bombs that Frank was making in there. A deafening sound explodes from the shed, so loud that it shatters the windows of the house. Shrapnel barely misses Frank, and when he looks back up, Eric is gone. Frank goes back into the house. His father sits at the table with a carving knife in his hand. "That was Eric," Frank said through heavy breath and laughs. "He's gone. You won't need that knife. Instead, tell me what the specimen jar was." His father, holding the jar as well, laughs and drops it on the floor, and it shatters. He picks up something from it and holds it out for Frank to look at. And to Frank's surprise, it isn't a testicle. It's a lump of wax in the shape of a penis. "Tell me," Frank says. Alright, final chapter. We aren't going to read it word for word, but the first page of it we will, because it is a story that Frank tells that I cannot discern the meaning of or message of, and we will also read the last page fully. Let's start with Frank's story at the beginning of the chapter. Frank starts this chapter with this story. "Once, far south, past even the new house, I went to go build some dams amongst the sand and rock pools on that part of the coast. It was a perfect, calm, luminous day. There was no line between the sea and the sky, and any smoke rose straight. The sea was flat. In the distance, there were some fields, set on to a mildly sloping hillside. In one field, there were some cows and 2 big brown horses. While I was building, a lorry came down a track by the field. It stopped by the gate, reversed, and turned so that the rear was facing me. I watched through binoculars as this went on about a half a mile away. 2 men got out. They opened the back of the truck so that a ramp was formed into its interior, wooden slated sides being folded out to make fences on either side of the ramp. The 2 horses came to watch. I stood in a rock pool, water around my Wellingtons, and I cast a watery shadow. The men went in the field and led one of the horses out, a rope around its neck. It went out with no complaint. But when the men tried to get it back into the truck, up the tailbird between the skewered slated sides, it shied and refused, leaned backwards. Its mate pressed against the fence beside it. I heard its cries, seconds late through the still air. The horse would not go. Some cows in the field looked on. They continued munching. Tiny waves, clear folds of light, consumed the sand, rock, weed, and shells beside me, lapping quietly. A bird called in the calmness, and the men moved the truck away, led the horse after it down the track and along an offshoot with it. The horse in the field cried out and ran in pointless circles. My arms and eyes grew tired, and I looked away, at the line of the hills and mountains marching into the glowing light of the north. When I looked back, they had the horse inside the truck. The truck moved off, wheels spinning briefly. The lone horse, confused again, ran from the gate to the fence and back again, first following the truck, then not. One of the men had stayed behind in the field with it, and as the truck disappeared over the brow of the hill, he calmed the animal. Later on my way back home, I passed the field with the horse in it, and it was quietly cropping grass. That's the end of Frank's story at the beginning of the chapter. What does it mean? I have no idea. Tell me in the comments after the context of the whole chapter. Frank then says that he is on the dune near the bunker after last night. After his father told him the truth, he passed out from disbelief and woke up to a weird acceptance. They then went outside and looked for Eric, boarded up the cellar again, and then they went to bed, and Frank dreamed about the story about the horses. Biggs came by in the morning, and Frank's father had to talk to him about what happened with Eric. When he did, Frank left and went up to the dunes where he found Eric sleeping in the swaying grass peacefully, curled up in a fetal position. Frank sat down beside him and said, "Hello, Eric." To which he put his hand out, and Frank held his hand and smiled at him. Eric put his curly-haired head in Frank's lap and went to sleep. Francis Leslie called him. That is Frank's full name. Or at least, that's what she thought it was. Frances Leslie called him. Her real name. Frances's dad dressed Eric up as a sort of test drive. Then when old Saul mauled Frances, Dad did a little experiment to remove all female influence from their world. The stump of a penis on Frank was actually in a large clitoris on Frances. Frances's dad had been giving her hormones for the past 14 years, hence the no period and no beard and stuff like that. But her dad kept the tampons just in case the hormones of Frances beat out the male ones given to her. But overall, Frances is a normal female. Part of Frances hopes it's just another one of her dad's sick jokes, but deep down she knows it's not. She's a female. She's accepted it. She can give birth or have intercourse like any other woman, though she says she shudders at the thought of either of those. She says she has decided she cannot stay here after all of this. She even considered suicide, but she felt her relative's suicide would be too great of a task to outdo the grandiosity of them. So, she looks down at Eric, peacefully sleeping in her lap. She looks out over the island, and it's like things have changed. The geography or the landscape even seem to have. In 6 months, the cold winter air will blow over the island just like any other. She says she wants to laugh or cry or both. She can't decide. Thinking about her 1 life and 3 deaths. 4 now, she thinks and laughs. Her father murdered what she was. But she says that she is still there. The same person. The same memories, the same crimes. She for the first time wonders how she could have done those things. The final page says, "Perhaps it was because I thought I had all that really mattered in the world. The whole reason and means for our continuance as a species, stolen from me before I even knew its value. Perhaps I murdered for revenge, in each case, jealously exacting, through the only potency at my command. A toll from those who passed within my range. My peers, who each would otherwise have grown into one thing I could never become. An adult. Lacking, as one might say, one will, I forged another, to lick my own wound. I cut them off, reciprocating in my angry innocence the emasculation I could not then fully appreciate. But somehow, through the attitudes of others, perhaps sensed as an unfair, irrecoverable loss. Having no purpose in life or procreation, I invested all my worth in that grim opposite, and so found a negative and negation of the fecundity only others could lay claim to. I believe that if I could never become a man, I, the unmanned, would outman those around me. And so I became the killer. A small image of a ruthless soldier hero, almost all I've ever seen or read seems to pay strict homage to. I would find or make my own weapons, and my victims would be the most recently produced by the one act I was incapable of. My equals in that, while they possessed the generation, they were at that point no more able to perform the required act that I was. Talk about penis envy. Now it all turns out to have been for nothing. There was no revenge that needed taking. Only a lie. A trick that should have been exposed. A disguise which, even from the inside, I should have seen through. But in the end, I did not want to. I was proud. Eunuch, but unique. A fierce and noble presence in my lands. A crippled warrior, fallen prince. Now I find I was the fool all along. Believing in my great hurt, my literal cutting off from society's mainland, it seemed to me I took life, in a sense, too seriously. And the lives of others, for the same reason, too lightly. Their murders were my own conception, my sex. The factory was my attempt to construct life, to replace the involvement which otherwise I did not want. Well, it is always easier to succeed at death. Inside this greater machine, things are not so cut and dried, or cut and pickled. as they may have appeared in my experience. Each of us, in our own personal factory, may believe we have stumbled down one corridor and that our fate is sealed and certain. Dream or nightmare, humdrum or bizarre, good or bad, but a word, a glance, a slip, anything can change that, alter it entirely. And our marble hall becomes a gutter, or our rat maze a golden path. Our destination is the same in the end, but our journey, part chosen, part determined, is different for us all, and changes even as we live and grow. I thought one door had snicked shut behind me years ago, and in fact, I was still crawling about the face. Now the door closes and my journey begins. I look down at Eric again, and I smile and nod to myself in the breeze while the waves break and the wind moves spray and grass and few birds call. I suppose I'll have to tell him what happened to me. Poor Eric came home to see his brother, only to find zap, pow, dams burst, bombs go off, wasps fry, tst. He's got a sister. That is it. That is Wasp Factory by Iain Banks. Quite the story, huh? Not really like the others we've covered. It's not so much one big story as it is a bunch of them tied to one central theme. You can see what I mean by it is both forward-thinking and ironic how Francis treated women in the beginning. But what are the themes or the messages or takeaways from this book, Pugzer? What is with the Wasp Factory and the bunker and Old Saul's skull? Why divination? What does Francis learn after she finds out the truth? Well, let's talk about it. But before we do, I want to hear what you guys think for all of those questions first in the comments. Then after, unpause the video and see how we compare. If we have different takeaways, it doesn't mean you are right and I am wrong, or vice versa. It is subjective. This book is also very confusing, so I want to hear everybody's takeaways. Okay, pause the video. Done? Alright, let's get into it. There are two big themes I get from this book that we're going to talk about a little bit more than I usually would here. There are a couple smaller themes, and we'll discuss those later. One, gender and how this book satirizes sexism pretty hard. And two is the control over the uncontrollable. Let's start with number one. In this book, sexism is rampant. However, it is clearly meant to be satire. Francis is not the most reliable narrator, if you could not tell. Francis is just straight up unwell. She killed 3 people in the past. She mentions several times how men are superior in the art of violence and women are not, or something. She says that she straight up hates women on more than one occasion at that, which makes it ironic when in the end, she turns out to be a woman herself and is proven wrong because all the violence that was used was by a woman in the end. Frances struggles pretty hard with her gender throughout the entire book, even though it is not outwardly stated. There are a lot of clues as to it in the book. In one of the first chapters, she says she just straight up doesn't like how she looks. She feels she is chubby or soft or weak, not like she idealizes herself, a dark and brooding man. In the book, she even calls herself a not quite man before she even knew she was born a woman. I'm not sure if I quoted this directly in the summary, but she also calls herself an honorary man at some point in the book before she knew her secret, making it seem like she struggles to even call herself a man before she learns the circumstances of her own birth. She believes this is due to her castration by Old Saul, however, and not her birth. She felt like less of a man because of her lack of a penis. She compensates so heavily because of this as well. She uses violence heavily, as she believes it is the manly thing to do, heavily to compensate. She also mentions in the last chapter that women are meant to bring life into the world. He also mentions in the last chapter to compensate for the fact that he could never bear children, or so she thought. She felt it upon her to take life instead, destroy instead of create. She implies that women are less than for their lack of proclivity for violence or something like that women are weak and break easily. But when she realizes she's born a woman, it kind of makes it very ironic for Frances. When she finds out at the end, she almost has like an ego death in a way. Her philosophy breaks, and it's hard to say if she becomes a better person for it, but it seems like she does. Though it's hard to become a better person after murdering 3 people. Number 2 is control as a form of power over things that are uncontrollable. Each and every one of the Caldum family struggles with control issues. They use weird forms of control as a compensation for trying to control their life or rewrite their own mistakes. Let's start with Angus, Francis and Eric's dad. Angus is a pretty fucked up guy, like maybe as bad as Eric and Francis. To take back control after losing his wife, of her own volition, mind you, Angus exerts control heavily over Frances. And it's possible Frances pegs it pretty good when she says that Angus tried to remove all female influence from his kids and his kids' life due to either grief, sadness, or anger over Agnes, his wife, or maybe even his leg. Which, by the way, I would never marry someone with a name so close to my own. Just saying, Angus and Agnes is really close. Angus, first of all, takes away Frances's real gender from her. He also lies that Frances doesn't have a birth certificate, which she probably does have, but Angus lies that she doesn't have one. Something Angus is shown to do a lot of in the book. Just lie to keep a sense of control. Remember, Frances even says that he has some weird-ass sense of humor by telling Frances things that are just straight up not true her entire life, robbing her of her entire life up to this point, pretty much. Eric, however, is different, and I did not come up with this theory, just so you know, but I read this one online, to be fair. But Frances is correct that Eric's mind is pretty broken. It's very possible that Eric knows that Frances has killed people, and knows that their father fake castrated her. It's very possible, at least. People seem to believe that Eric's seemingly random proclivity for setting dogs on fire of all things might be an attempt to rewrite the past by killing dogs that represent Old Saul, the dog that kind of started the whole downward spiral of Frances's life. Eric is an extremely empathetic person, that's shown. He is extremely kind before his break. He shows that with the little fake wars with Frances where he pretends to sacrifice himself for her. Something he continues to try to do by burning dogs, sacrificing himself for his little sister, or little brother maybe in his mind. But obviously, his mind is pretty shattered, and he doesn't understand why he's doing it. Finally, Frances, the biggest offender as she is the main character, and we know the most about her. There are so many weird forms of her trying to take control back over her life after her loss of genitalia, or her life in general as she thinks of it. First is the Wasp Factory, the namesake of the book. The skull divination as well. Obviously, none of it's real. It's arbitrary. It doesn't matter where the little wasp goes in the torture dungeon that Frances made. It's an attempt to control the future and things in life when she cannot. She strives for control because she has none. She lost her gender, her penis, her mind, everything in her own imagination. She also kills people for both a sense of masculinity and control as well. It makes her feel powerful. Same thing with killing animals. When the huge bunny gets one over on her, she literally has to almost compulsively kill every single bunny. She has to take control back. Then randomly, she tries to control the universe or try to understand it heavily by killing people, where she says she has to kill people to even up the score for each gender in the universe with a woman instead of killing a man. The book fully is boiled down in a twisted sense of trying to control others when you cannot control yourself. There are some more things I didn't really fully go over, like religion, or what is really being insane, or if insanity is the right word for Eric really, or if all of them are insane for that matter, or how often a family can make or break you. Another one I've seen tossed around is trying to control your life when everybody ends up the same way, dead, is useless. And you should be going with the flow pretty much, is another one I've seen. But I think the two main ones are gender and control, which go hand in hand in most of the cases of the book. But that is about it for this one. I really do like this book. It's a bit different from the ones we've covered before, like I said, and a very small, funny anecdote about me that relates to the story that I found funny when I was reading it was when I was young, I would go to my cousin's house a lot, and they had a pug named Frank. For the first 8 years of my life, I thought Frank was a boy pug because of the name Frank, but Frank was a girl pug. And I found that relates to the story in some way, and I don't know why I'm telling you this. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it. This book is actually pretty forward-thinking in the end for 1984, and I think it's actually really well written, except for the times it just straight up gets confusing. But I believe it's intentional, being in the mind of a completely shattered teenager. Lots of stuff is disjointed in the book. I really love all of you for watching it all the way to this point and being a part of this community. It means the world to me that I can do this as an actual job now, kinda. And you are all heroes to me for that. Let me know in the comments what your favorite dog breed is if you got this far. Mine is a pug, obviously. I love you all, and I will see you all in the next video.